Welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024, and today is New Hampshire primary day. A very exciting time on both the Democratic side and the Republican side, but in this video, we are going to be focusing on the Republican side as Republicans face off between Donald Trump and Nikki Haley in the last grand stand of the 2024 primary season. Now, the reason why I say that is because this race could very well make or break the future of the Republican primary. Donald Trump, who has practically gotten out every single other candidate out of the race, and Nikki Haley, who is the only remaining major candidate that is staying in the race. Candidates like Ron DeSantis recently dropped out in a major announcement endorsing Donald Trump in a huge surprise to many people, but not so much if you were paying close attention, with Christie out of the race, Asa Hutchinson, surprisingly enough, who stayed longer in the race than expected, also withdrawing from the race as well, amongst many other candidates. And so looking at the state of New Hampshire right now, we are looking to see what happens in this supposed battleground state. We have a lot of data that seems to suggest that New Hampshire, of all the primary contests, is the most competitive. A Republican electorate that is very different than many of the others across the country, New Hampshire serves at the unique intersection of Republican and conservative ideology, but also for freedom and pro-choice and general freedom of speech that the Republican Party on the grand major stage doesn't always agree with. When you look at the specifics in the state of New Hampshire, you find that the reason why Donald Trump is even in this competitive position compared to other states like Iowa, where he trounced his second place candidate there, Ron DeSantis, who then eventually, of course, as I just showed you, dropped out and endorsed him, is that the fundamentals in this race are just so different. Iowa is a state that has a very large evangelical population, and it is the first in the nation that was supposed to set the tone, but many candidates sort of vacated responsibility from this race, left the state of Iowa early, headed over to New Hampshire. Even Ron DeSantis' campaign announced that he'd be focusing on states like Nevada and South Carolina, and then eventually he realized that there was no pathway forward for him in this Republican primary race. Nikki Haley, on the contrary, didn't really expect much out of the state of Iowa, but she did believe she would come in second. Though she did come in third, she announced that this had made this a two-way race, to many people's surprise, some even speculating that she read the wrong speech when she was up on the stage. But ultimately, Iowa was a warning sign to Nikki Haley that maybe New Hampshire wouldn't go as well as was expected. And so now we're on primary day, and this is the time where we're going to take a look at what we expect the results to be and all of the factors that have led up to my overall expectations for both Nikki Haley and Donald Trump, and why I fundamentally believe that Donald Trump is on track to win the New Hampshire primary today. And I would be shocked if I was wrong. And so, like I said, there are a number of reasons for it, but I think most important here is the fact that the race actually has narrowed down to these final two. What we know about head-to-head races is that, typically speaking, candidates that are not in these head-to-head races, for example, those who were Ron DeSantis or Vivek Ramaswamy, would be forced in their supporting groups to choose a candidate that they otherwise might not have already wanted, right? Nikki Haley and Donald Trump have been options, in fact, the longest-standing major party options, and yet some voters opted for candidates that weren't either of them. And so when they're forced to choose a candidate, there's two scenarios that sort of end up coming to fruition here. One is that you don't have them vote at all. Some of these people are just so disenchanted with the way that this Republican primary has gone that they aren't happy with the final two options. This has happened on both sides of the aisle in years past, but generally in the general election, these voters do ultimately come around. On the flip side of things, you could find that they do ultimately make a choice. And for a lot of what we've seen in recent dropouts, it's that it has all nearly benefited Donald Trump. You see, when you take a look at the Iowa caucus, you find that sure, Ron DeSantis got 21% of the vote, and sure, Nikki Haley got 19% of the vote. Combined, roughly 40% of the electorate was on the side of Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. But that doesn't mean that all of the DeSantis supporters aren't Trump supporters in their second choice. There were plenty of people out there, including plenty of Trump supporters, that Ron DeSantis was their second choice. Plenty of Ron DeSantis supporters that Donald Trump was their second choice. And it doesn't help that Ron DeSantis dropping out has now endorsed Donald Trump. That, coupled with the fact that Vivek Ramaswamy also dropped out and endorsed Donald Trump, means there's a general coalition around here that if you were to take the combined vote share in the Iowa caucus, Nikki Haley would be talking about a margin of around 75 to 19. So you start to see how it becomes even more deafening. And so when you look at some of the other candidates that have dropped out of the race, for instance, candidates like Christie, who had a large portion of the vote in the New Hampshire primary, I kid you not, when you take a look at where he was prior to him dropping out, Christie was hovering around 10 to 12 points in this state. At one point in time, Donald Trump was just at 44.7%, at his low point at 43% across the state. Nikki Haley was at 29%. And when Christie was polling around 12, 13%, the argument here was that he would shift all of his support to Nikki Haley. Instead of that happening, Christie said that Nikki Haley was going to get smoked, gave no indication that he was going to endorse her, and Nikki Haley came out against him the next day and said, I don't need Christie's endorsement, which means it probably isn't going to happen. You see, there's a problem here. Nikki Haley was supposed to do phenomenal enough in Iowa that it would force Ron DeSantis out of the race a lot earlier than just days before the New Hampshire primary, enough to bring in endorsements from people like Christie, bringing endorsements from many mainstream Republicans that might say, hey, there's a shot here that Nikki Haley wins the nomination. But because she had a lackluster showing in Iowa, and then Ron DeSantis and Vivek Ramaswamy endorsed Donald Trump and Christie refused to endorse either candidate, it all came crashing down. And as we saw now in the New Hampshire polls, is that Donald Trump, with the departure of Ron DeSantis out of the race, has seen a skyrocket in his numbers, polling the highest he ever has in the presidential primary. Nikki Haley, who at one point in time in New Hampshire was hovering at just around 4 or 5% across the state, is also at her highest point across, but just at 37%. Right now, with Donald Trump leading by around 19 points. And so Iowa is a major factor as to why I believe that Donald Trump will win in the state of New Hampshire. But another thing here is that while I don't put all of my trust in polls, I do think they have some merit, especially in this recent election season. When you're taking a look at the Iowa Republican Presidential Caucus, we note here that Donald Trump performed nearly exactly as he was expected in the Iowa caucus polling. Nikki Haley was nearly exact as well, on average at 18.8%, got 19.1%. Ron DeSantis with the only significant uptick of around a 6 to 7 point advancement. Ramaswamy was off by less than a point. Hutchinson was off by less than a point, and the main takeaway here was that the overall polling in the state of Iowa ended up being quite accurate. And so that doesn't exactly spell out good news when you look at New Hampshire's primary polls, which also has a history of being correct. In 2016, when this Republican primary was going on and Donald Trump won the state of New Hampshire, he was expected to win by 17. He ended up winning by around 19. And so you find here that the polls actually weren't far off. Contrary to popular opinion in 2016, there were many instances in which the polls actually were correct, especially in the Republican primary. And so when you take a look at how New Hampshire ultimately ended up, you find that Donald Trump getting around 35% of the vote when he was predicted to get 31% shows that there is some merit in New Hampshire polls. Now, looking at the most recent data that shows head-to-head matchups following the departure of Christie, Ramaswamy, and DeSantis in the race, we have 3 new polls, all of which show Donald Trump with at least a 20-point victory. The most recent one from Boston Globe and Suffolk University shows Trump at 60%, Haley at 38%. Insider Advantage historically leans Republican, more nonpartisan now, 62 to 35. Trafalgar, which is a right-wing leaning source, which hasn't historically been super accurate, but very much in the average here with Trump plus 22. My takeaway: these polls are really bad news for Nikki Haley. And so I think as we look at the state of New Hampshire, she did have a lot going for her. I think the enthusiasm and energy around her potential victory in this state was largely guided by the fact that she received an endorsement from Governor Sununu very early on in this race, or at least early on enough that it had been over a month ago when Sununu endorsed her. And Sununu is quite popular in this state. He consistently wins re-election. He won in a Democratic wave year with Democratic voters switching across party lines. He even won re-election back in 2020 when Jeanne Shaheen won the Senate race by 15 and Joe Biden won the presidential by 8 points across the state. New Hampshire voted for Sununu by a pretty significant amount. Then in 2022, of course, voted for him again, and so now he's deciding to leave the governorship and not run in 2024, but is endorsing Nikki Haley here and has been for a while on the campaign trail for nearly every single day. And it's been quite interesting to watch them campaign because a lot of people are speculating that if Nikki Haley does win the nomination, she would choose him and tap him as a potential vice presidential pick, which would be very interesting. But I don't think it's even going to get that far. Because despite the endorsement from the governor in New Hampshire, I think Ron DeSantis can be the first to tell you that an endorsement from a governor doesn't mean everything. When Governor Kim Reynolds from the state of Iowa endorsed Ron DeSantis, it was supposedly big news. But did it shift the market? Did it shift the electorate? Not really. In New Hampshire, I think it did slightly. Because again, Donald Trump winning in Iowa was largely reliant on that more conservative fundamentally in religion, in economics, and whatever it might be, especially in very salient issues now like abortion that matter a lot to voters in Iowa, an electorate that is arguably equally pro-choice and pro-life. New Hampshire, on the contrary, as I was saying very early on, is an extremely pro-choice. Even Republican electorate, the majority of Republicans in New Hampshire are pro-choice here, and you find that freedom in every regard, is fundamental in New Hampshire politics, which is why I think Nikki Haley, who takes a more moderate approach across the state, like Chris Sununu, who has also, taken a more pro-choice stance compared to the rest of the Republican Party in the state of New Hampshire, you find that type of Republican ideology tends to do well in the state. But Donald Trump has a grip here, a grip that following the endorsement of Ramaswamy and DeSantis, you find that those voters didn't flee to Nikki Haley. In fact, her numbers remain largely unchanged. What I'm most interested by are the numbers that show the three-way race, when DeSantis remained in the race, and Christie and Ramaswamy had also decided to pull out. And so that was a bit of a limbo phase. I think we all remember it when Christie, had pulled out, and there was all this expectation, okay, Haley's going to get a bump. She didn't get a bump. Ramaswamy pulls out of Iowa. Trump does get a bump. But here's the three-way race numbers, right? The three-way race. Haley at 39, 34, and 37. Trump at 50, 52, 53, and DeSantis holding out 6, 8, 10. And the hope here was that DeSantis supporters would move over to Nikki Haley, because if they weren't on the Trump train in the state of New Hampshire, they were choosing DeSantis because of this fundamental belief in freedom, not because they were Trump light. We are now realizing, and I think we could have expected this entirely, but I think some on the Republican side are now surprised by the fact that Nikki Haley today in New Hampshire has not seen any improvement in terms of her numbers, because the average that she's at now is roughly the average she was at when Ron DeSantis was in the race. On the other side, Donald Trump has seen a significant uptick in support, going from 50 to 60, 52 to 62, 53 to 58. It's an improvement regardless, when in some instances, Nikki Haley actually has less support in this two-way race. And so now looking at it from that lens, I think we take into account many things: the polls, the endorsement, the momentum from Iowa, the dropouts in the late stage, or I guess late stage. You should see me, I'm doing air quotes here because it really isn't that late in this primary season. Only one race has really been allocated, and that is the state of Iowa. But it is so exceptionally interesting because Iowa set the stage for all these other candidates to drop out, all these other candidates to vacate their responsibilities as presidential candidates, to decide that the next election was theirs. Ron DeSantis is very much gearing up for 28. Ramaswamy as well, polling quite high, honestly. When you take a look at the first GOP primary polling data in 2028, I'll actually cover that in a future video because I think it's quite interesting if you ask me. But the takeaway here is that in a very, very early on or very late, depending on who you are in this race, probably later for Nikki Haley, who's been running for over a year now, this is setting the stage for quite literally everything. Because if Nikki Haley wins tonight in the state of New Hampshire, she proves me wrong, she proves you wrong, she proves everybody wrong. All the naysayers, maybe you're on her side and you think that she's going to win, and she proves you right. Regardless, if she does that, conversations are now explored further. And I will completely retract that I, said that this was going to Trump solidly. I think that that would take a lot more reevaluation about the validity of some of the data that we have, what our expectations are for the future of the primary. But it's so unlikely that I don't even think entertaining this beyond a few seconds is worthwhile. And so I think the only reality in which we actually see her win is if there is this super significant amount of crossover support from Democrats that don't see their primary as consequential, especially since the DNC won't recognize the delegates allocated in the New Hampshire primary. Joe Biden himself not even on the ballot there. And so they see that as an unserious race between Dean Phillips, a write-in campaign, and Marianne Williamson. They switch over to the New Hampshire side, all in an effort to stop Donald Trump. And maybe that's where Nikki Haley can get her race. But then the question is, what then? Right, I don't think there is a mathematical pathway forward for Nikki Haley. I think she wants to be this head-to-head race, with Donald Trump, so she can run in 2028. She can come in as this second-place candidate, which she undoubtedly will get. In the same way Ted Cruz got it, we saw how well that worked out for him in future presidential bids. Spoiler alert, it didn't, and it won't. But regardless, I think that's what she's gunning for. But as of right now, I do not think she wins this primary. And so if I was to call the shot today, I would say that Donald Trump would get roughly 59% support in this state, and Nikki Haley would get the remainder. I think this would be a state that would be more competitive than quite literally every other primary. When you take a look at the national numbers here, I can actually just show you because I think it's very interesting. It looks nothing like New Hampshire does. Trump plus 19 translates to Trump plus 55 on the national. In a head-to-head race here, Donald Trump already in the three-way race was getting 71% support nationwide. Haley getting just 9%. DeSantis at 10%. Can you imagine what it would be head-to-head? More like 80 to 9. Not a good look for Nikki Haley. So like I said, New Hampshire will likely break down how this does. I think there's going to be around a 20-point margin for Donald Trump over Nikki Haley. I think the polls are quite accurate unless we see a super significant change in overall, composition of the electorate, meaning more Democrats and independents who are switching over, and just a huge blow up on the Donald Trump side. As of right now, Donald Trump is slated to easily win the New Hampshire primary, and I have so much confidence that he does by a pretty significant margin, essentially ending Nikki Haley's presidential bid. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 Republican primary election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.